This is the Decarbonization Disruptors Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Cohen. On this episode of our podcast, I am pleased to welcome Courtney Blodgett, Director of Strategy and co-founder of EDO. EDO's mission is to enable a decarbonized grid through a building-centric approach that unlocks the ability of commercial buildings to become reliable grid assets. Courtney, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. I've been seeing EDO in my LinkedIn ecosystem for a long time now, so I'm really excited to learn more about what you're doing there. I wanted to first get into, kind of your motivation to focus your career in climate policy. I know you did that earlier in your career, so I want to learn more about kind of how you came to that and what got you into that world.
Yeah, I knew from a pretty young age that I wanted to work on environmental issues. I grew up in a very urban area in the Northeast, and we used to go to Vermont, to rural areas when I was younger as a kid. And I just saw how much joy that the mountains and the forest brought people. And so kind of in that child kind of way, you're like, what can I do to protect this? So I went to undergrad to study environmental science. And while I was there, I had to write a paper on environmental policy. And I chose to write the paper on what is the Kyoto Protocol, which is an international treaty around climate change. And I wrote this paper before it went into effect. But this climate change just really connected with me, with the impact of it, with how it touched everything in our world. And so since I wrote that paper, I've dedicated my life to trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to help people become more resilient to the impacts of climate change.
And a lot of that work, as I noticed from your career, focused on sustainable technology and solutions in Africa and some other developed countries. And what I was curious about in learning about that in your career, what do you think the developed world can learn from how developing nations see sustainability and renewable energy solutions that we can take and adopt it in the U.S. and other similar countries?
Yeah, I was really lucky in the first part of my career to get to work on renewable energy, energy efficiency in countries around the world. And I eventually moved to Rwanda, a small country in Central Africa, and helped to build up their climate change unit in the government and help to bring the private sector into Rwanda. And one of the things that you see when you're working in Sub Saharan Africa, the grid in the US is over 100 years old. And so what we're trying to do is repair the old grid, bring in new technologies. But the grid in a lot of parts of Sub Saharan Africa is really new. And so you can just leapfrog over the old technologies and start with new technologies. So later in my career, I was running a portfolio of smart solar and battery mini grids in rural Kenya. And so with these grids, I was able to see pretty much real time what the consumption was. So these grids were connecting somewhere between 50 and 150 households and small businesses. And so if a welder started welding something, I would see the consumption spike. And so having this type of real-time data allowed us to design different programs for the customer. So these are energy as a service programs, time of use rates. So a lot of the things that are being discussed now, we were doing more than a decade ago in Africa because we had this data and we had this deep understanding of what customers were doing with the electricity and when they were using it. And so that's something, when I came back to working in the US, I was working with a utility in the Northeast, and I was trying to get consumption data for households. And they sent me monthly data that 3 of the 12 months of the year were missing. So I went from having real-time data from my customers to not being able to get monthly data. And so that difference in data is something that the US is slowly catching up on, and I'm really excited about that. So utilities around the country are installing advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, and that is able to give people 15-minute data for the most part. There have been a lot of challenges with that. Either we can't access the data or nobody's using the data, but it at least lays the groundwork for using data and be able to design solutions that really meet customer needs in a way that's being done for, over 10 years in Africa because they've had that real-time data.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that because, I mean, I've been in the industry recruiting in the energy software space for actually this week will be 12 years. And there's so many software companies out there, but what you're telling me is even with all the software that's available for all this time, that we're not leveraging it, is what I'm hearing, is that we're not leveraging it, if I'm hearing it correctly, at a granular level that we should be. And that seems to be the solution, at least in most part.
It's part of the solution. There's many different aspects, but when you're designing something to help change somebody's behavior or help meet people's needs, you need to understand what their needs and behaviors are. And so that's what that data can help provide, is insight into customers' behavior with their permission for that data. And that's an important part of all the use of data, is data privacy and what customers are comfortable with. But that data really helps to unlock a lot of aspects of energy efficiency and demand flexibility. And so that's a really big part of what EDO is doing, is unlocking that data from commercial buildings, so larger buildings.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear more about sort of how the story of EDO came about, how it was founded, and then also wanted to get more into how your the offering specifically uses the VPP technology that we're seeing now, and what the uniqueness is around that in your solution.
Yeah, so EDO was formally founded in 2021, but our origin was actually from an eco-district development that happened prior to that. So McKinstry, which is a nationwide commercial building design, build, energy services contractor, partnered with Avista, which is an innovative investor-owned utility in Eastern Washington, to build what is now one of the largest net zero carbon campuses in the country. And this campus is highly efficient and grid interactive. So it has heat pumps, it's got storage, both electrical and thermal, it's got solar, it's got EV charging, kind of all the different aspects of distributed energy sources, or DERs, that can respond to the grid. So the land that South Landing Eco District was developed on was supposed to be a new Avista substation. And instead they said, why don't we try something new? Why don't we see if commercial buildings can become a grid asset? And so the project was so successful that then they said, how about we create a company that really tries to further this idea of turning commercial buildings into efficient grid interactive assets? And so that was kind of the history behind EDO. And then my co-founder, Hendrik van Hemer, he was at McKinstry for a long time working on the building side, and I joined McKinstry on the innovation side, bringing the grid knowledge. And so the two of us then spun EDO out and formally launched it in 2021. And so what our solution is we go into commercial buildings and pull data from anything in the building that's streaming data. So most of the data is coming from the building management system, so the HVAC equipment. But if there are occupancy sensors, smart lighting, DERs, we pull all of that data and we map all those data points so that we understand what each one of them is. So the data often comes out in a long string of letters and numbers. And so we have an AI-driven mapping tool, and we then say, okay, this long string of letters and numbers, that is actually the set point temperature for the library connected to the rooftop unit 1. And then we have this data, and we can first find opportunities to optimize the building. And so we do that through low-cost energy efficiency measures. So often, a building is installed in whatever decade it's installed in, and then everything starts to drift. Set point temperatures, the heating and cooling of the building drifts outside of what the temperature band is supposed to be. A lot of sensors get broken. And so we partner with facility managers to identify all of those things that are causing a building to consume more energy, so operating inefficiently, and also making people uncomfortable. If all of those small parts of a building aren't functioning well, you're going to have the hot and cold spots that we all hate so well. You're going to have high humidity. You're going to have these other issues. So we start with implementing low-cost energy efficiency. And then we have this really detailed understanding of the building, and we create forecast of the building, how much load it's going to consume at what time. And then we're able to implement demand flexibility measures. So this is shifting and shedding of load to meet the grid need. So we mainly do this. For instance, you have a heat dome that has happened a couple of times down the Pacific Northwest, or the rest of the country, just a heat wave, and the grid is stressed. You're having these really high spikes in consumption. So what we would do is we would come into the building and start to the pre-cooling of the building in advance of that peak time. So if the peak time is going to be from 5 to 8 p.m. at night, at 3 p.m., we would start cooling the building so that when that peak starts at 5 p.m., the building's already cool and we can reduce the overall consumption of the building.
No, it makes sense. And please go ahead.
Yeah, and the last piece of it is then what makes a virtual power plant is aggregation of load. So that can be bringing batteries, or it can be homes or commercial buildings, EV charging. It's this aggregation of load that's being shifted or shed. And so then we're pulling together all of these different commercial buildings in a way that shows up as a power plant. So that's where you have the virtual power plant. It's a reduction in load, but on the grid, it looks like it's a power plant.
And I was curious to get your take on kind of the virtual power plant model, because we're seeing that more. We're seeing more software companies implement that. We're seeing more consulting, looking in that direction. Why do you think the increase in interest in VPPs are out there? What's the uniqueness that makes them a solution that makes sense for a lot of different environments?
Yeah, and it's definitely a hot topic right now and has been for the last about 12 months. When we started EDO, we would speak to utilities about demand flexibility and virtual power plants. They're like, okay, well, we'll come back to you. And in the last year, things have changed dramatically. And that's mainly caused by three different things. So the first one is increased manufacturing. So that is industrial facilities consume a lot of energy. So increased manufacturing. And then the second is electrification. So buildings and vehicles are being electrified and they're consuming more energy. And then the third one is this data center growth. So the electricity consumption in the US has been flat for decades, and now you're suddenly seeing this big spike that nobody was prepared for. And then on the other side of things, you have this transition to clean but variable renewable energy. So, solar facilities cannot be just ramped up like a gas peaker power plant can. And so it depends on when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing. And then you're also having these extreme weather events. So, these heat waves of intensity that we've not seen before. And so that's all just putting extra stress on the grid. And so utilities are trying to figure out, how do we meet these new peaks of the grid while also transitioning to clean energy? And virtual power plants are just a really elegant solution to this, because they can be created at a fraction of the cost and at a fraction of the time to install a new fossil fuel power plant to meet those peak needs.
What do you think can be done to get a solution like VPPs to scale, right? Because you would need a certain amount of buildings in a certain area to do that. If you're using that as a central solution for overall decarbonization, what's the tipping point to get them to a point of getting it at scale for an entire city, an entire county? What's the breaking point to get it at scale?
Yeah, customer first, like anything, that is one of the really important pieces of this. So you have fairly large home residential based VPPs in places like California, where utilities are adjusting thermostats by a couple of degrees. But you can only do that for so long, and then customers kind of get tired of it, or they don't want to participate anymore. Anything that has a really major impact on the customer is going to opt out. And historically, what's been done in commercial buildings, which in commercial buildings are a third or more of the load, if they've participated in a virtual power plant, it's been a pretty manual process of turning off a large portion of the building. And that obviously has a significant impact on the building operators, on the tenants. And so, at least for commercial buildings, there needs to be a new solution that keeps the customers happy. And so that's what Edo's solution is, that we're only adjusting set points by a couple of degrees. And so most of the time, the tenants don't even notice when an event is happening. And so this allows us to do a multiple demand flexibility events in a building, to bring in different buildings, because we also have this real value add for facility managers and building owners on the front end by doing this energy efficiency work. The energy efficiency work that we do improves the overall operations of the building and gives the facility manager this insight into all of their systems in one place. So we have that on the front end, and then we have minimal impact on the tenant on the back end. So that's what VPPs need to evolve to, is how can you do this in a way that doesn't impact tenants of the building or of the home.
And I'd be curious to get your thoughts too on, for overall decarbonization in the built environment, right? I mean, it's certainly a prevalent solution that we see out there, but I think in the pecking order of PE money and interest, it's not as high as we'd like it to be. And so, what is it? A messaging issue? Is it simply a funding? Is it policy? What is the thing that can bring building decarbonization to the highest point of interest? Because we know, being in the same industry, that a huge amount of energy is used by commercial buildings. And it's one of the biggest areas of carbon. So where do you think that one sticking point is that can bring it to the forefront, and what can be done to really get more interest and funding into that area?
Yeah, the built environment as a whole is 40% of our emissions. About 10% of that 40% are from embodied carbon. So that's carbon in the materials used for buildings. But the other 30% is from the operations of the built environment. So like you said, there's huge potential to reduce our emissions through working in buildings and making them more efficient. I think one of the challenges is that work like energy efficiency work is not the most exciting. It's not the latest buzzword. And so often you have VCs or private equity going after what's the buzzword, what's the most exciting thing on the market right now. And so that's been one of the general challenges with funding for companies working in the built environment, is energy efficiency is super important for so many reasons. But it's been around for a really long time. And so I get really excited whenever I talk to an investor. It's like, yeah, we're here for the important but kind of boring things. That is amazing to hear. And also, when you're doing this different work in buildings to reduce emissions, then you can do things like virtual power plants, which are the buzzwords. You can install distributed energy resources. So we can work with any DERs that are behind the meter. So if the building has no batteries today, but it makes sense cost-wise to install a battery in 2 years, then we bring that into what's happening at a holistic level for the building and any of the DERs. So you might start with things that are kind of boring, like energy efficiency, but then it opens up all these doors for other things that can be done in commercial buildings.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I've been in the industry for a decade plus now, and I do remember that, before it was just to see the data in your building was a big feat. And now, we're getting to I think a tipping point in technology where I think that interest in funding is going to grow. So, no, I mean, this has been fantastic. I think what you're doing at Edo is really impactful. In closing, anything else you want to share about what's going on at Edo now or upcoming that our audience should know and get excited about?
Yeah, well, we're just seeing really exciting results from our low-cost energy efficiency part of our solution. We're seeing an average of about 12% savings for energy consumption and cost for buildings. From our peak load shifting, we're able to peak 10 to 30% of the load of the peak load in the building in a way that has minimal impact on the tenant. And we're expanding into new markets. We're expanding into California, which has a really exciting demand flexibility market, New York, a lot of different places. So we're always happy to talk to partners or people who are interested in figuring out how do we make buildings operate in a more optimal way.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely exciting. It's always cool to see new solutions, new perspectives. And so really appreciate the work that you're doing at EDO and excited to see what you have going on in the future. So again, Courtney, thank you for doing this. And we'll hopefully be chatting again soon. This is the Decarbonization Disruptors Podcast, and we will see you next time.